Oh, the Rudel era. Well, people talk about the Rudel era. In a way, to me, the entire history of City Opera up until right now is in a sense the Rudel era. And that's because Julius Rudel was, in a sense, one of the founding fathers of New York City Opera. He has been with New York City Opera since it was a twinkle in Mayor LaGuardia's eye, I guess. He was in 1943, when the company was first conceived, if you will. Rudel had just graduated from Mannes. He had been born, of course, in Vienna. And he came over here, I think, when he was about 17 and went to the Mannes School of Music. And had just graduated and had heard about the fact that there was going to be a new opera company formed at City Center, this opera company for the people that everyone could afford to go to, and he was looking for a job. He was looking for his first job out of school, so he apparently wandered in and was hired on the spot and played the first set of auditions that New York City Opera ever had. So he was there from the very, very beginning, and he started sort of really entry level at the lowest possible rung of the hierarchy. But in 1944, City Opera opened its doors, and I think, if I'm right, by the second season of New York City Opera, he was making his conducting debut at the age of something like 23. He conducted a performance of The Gypsy Baron. And then, in addition to being a coach, repetiteur, and a conductor on the house roster, that he started to take on a series of administrative jobs, scheduling, and being the right-hand man of the general director, and so on and so forth. And, you know, he sort of grew up with New York City Opera. He came in there at the beginning of his career, and right at the beginning of New York City Opera's career, and they kind of grew up together. And then, of course, he became general director in 1957, and I think that's an amazing story of how that happened, because it was a time, I think in 1956, that New York City Opera had been through a series of very short-term general directors, and was having a period of great, great difficulty, financially, artistically, and the chances for its survival even were in question. And so what happened was the board at City Opera was considering to fill the position of general director all kinds of very famous, fancy, established conductors of the day, but the City Opera staff and the artists had a different idea. They marched into the board and they said, our next general director should be Julius Rudel, because this guy knows how to run the place. Basically, he's been running the place. He's a great conductor. He is a total man of the theater. And he understands how to run this place like nobody else. And here we have this young guy sitting right here, 36 years old or something like that. And why should we go and search out of our doors when we've got the right guy right here? And God bless them, that board listened, and they hired Julius Rudel as a general director. After a year's hiatus, New York City Opera opened again in 1957, and the rest is history. That really, the Rudel era was certainly a golden era at City Opera, and it spanned 25 years. He is the longest tenured general director we ever had, and the amazing things. I mean, that was, I think, the first years of City Opera from 1944 until 1957, when Maestro Rudel took over, were sort of, the infancy, the childhood of City Opera, and many great things were done. But I feel that probably more than anybody else, Maestro Rudel defined the company. It became something more in the Rudel era than this populist alternative to the Met that you could afford tickets to. He really, I don't want to say he didn't impose a profile. He sort of teased the company's profile out of itself. I think he understood the strengths of City Opera and what City Opera could do well and what City Opera could do better than anybody else. And he played to its strengths because he understood them. So, he brought in directors who could get the best out of singers. It was starting to be apparent that young American singers were amazingly versatile and grew up with a tradition of seeing in films and theater a tradition of acting that they could bring. He understood that there were American composers out there who were really ready to contribute to American culture and write operas. And of course, one of the most amazing things of the Rudel era were the Ford Foundation grants. There were 3 subsidized seasons of American opera under Rudel, and also something like 11 commissions of American operas. And I don't think we have ever seen anything in any American opera since then of such magnitude, that support and nurturing of American opera. And a lot of very notable American operas came out of it. The Crucible, Lizzie Borden, gosh, just so many things. The Good Soldier Schweik, on and on, and we began, New York City Opera then began to have a profile as a company that promoted American artists not just on stage, but not just interpreters, but creators. And if you talk to any of the composers that were around then, they tell you New York City Opera, it was the only place you could hope to have an American opera produced. And something like over a third of our repertory, which now is way over 200. It's about 250 or so operas. Way over a third of that are American works, and this really all started, for all intents and purposes, it started in earnest in the Rudel era. So there was, the populism, the emphasis on American singers and American operas. There was the sense of theatricality. There was the first embraces of technology. Our first telecast, 1976, The Ballad of Baby Doe, he was the host. He was the general director. And he made several recordings with the New York City Opera Orchestra and Chorus. There was Silver Lake, and there was, of course, Giulio Cesare. Well, that reminds me, when you talk about the Rudel era, first of all, that's when City Opera moved to Lincoln Center, 1966. And also, that was the year of Giulio Cesare. Maestro Rudel basically jump-started the American revival of Handel opera. That has really blossomed in recent decades at New York City Opera and elsewhere. But that's another gift, I think, that stems from the Rudel era that City Opera has given the U.S. is the Handel repertory. There were so many things. I mean, it was during the Rudel era that New York City Opera really became the company that all of the other regional opera companies looked to for innovation. What new things was the City Opera doing? And the face of opera in this country today would not be what it is at all without the Rudel era in New York City Opera. The reason I say that it extends until now, the Rudel era, is that I believe that even after he left in 1981, after a quarter century as the general director, and of course years before that working at City Opera since its founding, he remained a huge influence. So many of the things that he had begun became company traditions and flourished, and many of the artists still at City Opera maintained a relationship with Maestro Rudel as he was conducting all over the world, all over Europe, at the Met, everywhere. And I think one of the most spectacular things that has happened at New York City Opera in my time there is in 1966, he returned to the City Opera podium and conducted Così fan tutte. Now, he had conducted the City Opera premiere of Così fan tutte in the 1950s with this legendary cast of Phyllis Curtin, Frances Bible, Judith Raskin, Donald Graham, John Alexander, and James Pease. I mean, that's an A-team. That's an opera A-team. And he returned in 2006 to conduct this new production of Così. And it was a time at City Opera that it was just, people were walking on air. First of all, the music making was on such a high level. The orchestra played like you know, I mean, we have a pretty great orchestra, but the way they played for Rudel was really nothing short of amazing. And the singers, the way the singers sang, the music making, he just lifted it up to such an incredibly high level. And also just to have him walking around the halls, you felt like when he walked through the stage door, when Maestro Rudel walked through our stage door, it was like, here's our entire history walking the halls. And, you know, to be able to experience that was just so inspiring, I think, to everybody. And also another thing that he did, and this is something that the Rudel era was renowned for as well, is making stars. And, you know, of course, that famous Giulio Cesare not only brought Handel to America for all intents and purposes, but it made a star of Beverly Sills and Norman Traeger, who also are real emblems of City Opera and what it's all about. And you know, Rudel, he always had that eye for an ear for not only a great voice, but a great American singing actor. And he trusted his intuition. You know, he had a feeling that, yes, this person is really world class, is really going to make it. And he gave people chances. I remember Tatiana Troianos telling me a story about when she was a young, unknown singer, just fresh out of Juilliard, and she was hired to do some small roles at City Opera in the early 60s before she went to Europe and became a star. And she said she was covering the role of Jocasta in Oedipus Rex, and someone else was singing it, but during a stage rehearsal, she was sitting out in the house observing, as a cover does, and Rudel, you know, things weren't going well on stage, and Maestro Rudel wasn't happy. And he turned around and looked out into the house and said, "Troianos, come up here." And so she went, and she was well prepared. She sang Jocasta, and that was that. And she sang the role, and that really was probably the first really big thing that she did at City Opera before she went to Europe and became a star. And we, those of us now at City Opera, we saw that happen in 2006 because the woman who was supposed to sing Fiordiligi unfortunately had to miss a lot of rehearsals and ultimately cancel because she was under the weather. She had to have some surgery. And of course, you know, everybody went into a panic. Oh my gosh, this new production, Maestro Rudel's conducting. What, you know, Fiordiligis don't grow on trees. What are we going to do? And Maestro Rudel just said, well, you know, this cover is really good. It's Giuliana Di Giacomo, who is already creating quite a stir in the opera world, and I'm sure is going to be a very renowned, very, very busy leading lady. But he said, you know, this young lady, she's, you know, perfectly, you know, she's a perfectly wonderful Fiordiligi. Let's put her on, you know. And that old instinct of his kicked in, And here's Rudel back at City Opera, anointing the next, I mean, this young present generation of American singers, anointing one. And it was thrilling. Well, the answer to that is he didn't always. I mean, for instance, in the case of the Ford Foundation grants, those 3 glorious seasons of all American opera. Can you imagine any opera company doing a complete season of American opera now or any time? Well, he did that with the blessed help of the Ford Foundation. But the thing, and you know, commissioning those 11 American operas, adding that to the repertory. The answer to that is the big thing that a lot of people don't know about these Ford Foundation years is a lot of times the seats were not terribly filled, but thank goodness we had the support of the Ford Foundation. And but sometimes, you know, Maestro Rudel he had such conviction, and he knew that he needed to do this. New York needed it. City Opera needed to do this. And, you know, the result is, years later, there are some of those operas that he premiered and those American operas that he put on. Now, when we put on The Ballad of Baby Doe, or if we were to put on The Crucible, or now, you know, we're reviving Esther, you know, audiences will come, because now these things are legendary. They have a history, they have a track record, they have sort of a cachet to them. So he was so prescient. He understood that, you know, in a certain way, he was putting things on not just for today, but for tomorrow. And that, to me, is the sign of just a visionary leader, of a type of leader of which there are so few. What a brave man, but what a smart man, absolutely. But then, of course, he also had a sense of things that were really going to be blockbusters. Like, who else would have thought that putting on a Handel opera in 1966, that anybody would come to that, anybody would care about it? But he put that on with this amazing cast headed by Beverly Stills and Norman Traegle. And it became like this runaway hit, and as you know, made them stars and made Handel viable on stage again. They recorded it, and so that was, you know, he took a flyer on that one. He went out on a limb, and it paid off. You know, he got it produced beautifully so that it was really colorful and theatrical. He felt that he believed in the piece, he believed in Handel opera, and he said, all I have to do is show the public. You know, we have to show them Handel produced well, they'll get it. You know, and they did, and that's grown. And similarly with the sort of other rediscoveries, Die Tote Stadt, Mephistopheles, all those operas which were really unknown, not only the new American operas, but the pieces from the 19th century, early 20th century repertory that he just believed in. Or the other thing he did was to add pieces, the newest pieces coming from Europe, the important things that were coming over. I mean, they did the American premiere of the Fiery Angel by Prokofiev, the New York stage premiere of the Dialogues of the Carmelites, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He just knew these are great operas. New York needs to see them and hear them, and I believe in them. And most of the time, the proof was in the pudding. I mean, you know, of course, there were those things that did not succeed, but what we remember are the operas that and the performers that really that Maestro Rudel really put on the map, and there are so many you can't even begin to list them. Well, in extolling Julius Rudel as a visionary intendant, administrator, you know, we can't forget that he really, I believe, is one of the great conductors of the 20th and now the 21st century, because he's still going strong. He is just, it's hard to put into words what makes him a great conductor, but he is just one of those guys that knows how music goes. You trust him. He has complete authority in the orchestra pit because he is filled with music. I mean, I guess there's no other better way that I can say it, is that you just have the sense when you're watching him conduct that he knows how it goes. He conducts also with great nuance. I think that he challenges our orchestra, certainly from what I witnessed during Così, he challenges our orchestra to play with a kind of nuance that I think is revelatory even to them. I think after a performance of Così that I hope they went home feeling really good about themselves, because I think he challenges them to go beyond what they thought they could, and the singers too on stage. Absolutely. One of the great things about Rudel, this is one of the great lost arts of opera, which I really hope comes back, is that he's one of those old-fashioned maestros that, he sits down and coaches the singers himself. He works with them, which is just amazing. I mean, usually what happens in the opera world today is that the singers have coachings with the very fine repetiteurs of the opera house, and then the conductor comes jetting in at the last minute for tech week, and they work with the conductor. But to sit down in a practice room with the guy who's going to conduct the show, and have him lead you through the music, and that the prima donna and the maestro are working together to hammer out the interpretation of this particular leading role, is something all too rare today. But boy, does it show in a performance. It really does. And that was another thing that was so exciting, to see singers like Giuliano Di Giacomo and Kyle Fortmiller, these fabulous young American singers, having that experience of working with this man who was around when our company was founded and who has worked with all the greats and, has built our history and has, and just has so much music in him. And they are getting the direct benefit of that. And I know they felt that very deeply, and it so much showed in their performances. The emphasis on the young American singers, and spotting the talent and having confidence in your sense of being a star maker, being able to parse out who among all these young American singers are the standouts. And then there's the same thing with composers. Who's going to be a really great American theatrical voice among composers, and anointing them with commissions. So everything, the Americanness of the company, the New Yorkiness of the company, the willingness to embrace new theater styles and new theater technologies, and also the nurturing. It's not just throwing these kids on stage, but it's really the kind of bringing them up and nurturing the young singers, which I feel is something that we're actually getting back to now in a very serious way. All of these things, and City Opera standing as an innovator among American regional opera companies, these were things that really were established by Rudel. So just every day that City Opera wakes up in the morning and takes a breath, it's Rudel's legacy. It's the extension of the Rudel era, really.